the very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious, the whole state of things, the pure violence without option anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins, as always sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce today's discussion, we just want to mention briefly, we do have a Patreon account at patreon.com/MUHH. If you're enjoying what we're doing, consider tossing us $1 a month there. That gives you access to our Discord server. There's some additional content available. Please keep that in mind if you're enjoying what we're doing. Today, we're going to be having a look at Simondon's Individuation in Light of Notions of Form and Information. That is a tongue twister of a title.
It is part 2, the individuation of living beings, pages 167 to
257, I believe.
Yeah, that's right. About 90 pages, right in the middle of volume 1.
So I'll start. I want to orient the listeners here because the chapter is dense and it's long, and I don't think it's immediately apparent what Simondon's doing here, but it's all very good stuff. He's working through biology specifically, like it kind of reads in some ways almost like a biology textbook. There is a philosophical angle in the background that, again, he doesn't forefront that. So just want to have the shape of the chapter in mind so the annotations and everything that we're going to go through land properly. One thing to keep in mind as well is that there's what I'll refer to as 3 registers of being one, which are going to pay off throughout the episode. Whenever we say, I am one person, we're making a claim that operates at 3 levels simultaneously, but we don't really pay attention. So the first register is the biological. Under the biological, I am this body. I have a membrane that separates me from my environment. I have organs working together. And this is the most obvious kind of thing that we assume whenever we point to ourselves. The second register is going to be ontological. From that register, I am a unit. I can be counted. I am distinguishable from other units. I have a beginning and an end, a lifespan, an identity that persists over time. This is what makes, quote unquote, one person a thing you can count rather than a continuous process that has no clear edges. Third register is transindividual. I am the kind of thing that can enter into a collective. I can be part of a we, not just an I. I can participate in community without being dissolved into it. This is what makes relationships, politics, and collective action actually meaningful to speak of. These registers stack into something that we sort of take for granted, I think. They sit atop one another invisibly. So when you say, I am one person, you're asserting all 3 of these different registers simultaneously. And they reinforce each other so smoothly that you'd really have to strain and think about all 3 of those sets of claims together. The work that Simondon does here is to pry those separate registers apart. And he's going to try to show us that being one is a layered accomplishment rather than a single fact. So those layers can come apart. One example he uses or discusses is the amoeba. The amoeba has a biological membrane, so that'd be register 1, but it's not really an individual. The individual would be register 2, and this is because the amoeba divides and it doesn't die. We die. We reproduce in a different fashion to where a new offspring. Picture the difference between an amoeba that divides through simple, mitosis, and animal reproduction that uses meiosis. We'll get into this, but I think there's some interesting stuff that ties back into Freud as well as Lacan with the lamella. Isn't it beyond the pleasure principle that Freud talks about membranes and like
The
the
German and the Soma, which
right,
comes up as well in this section, stuff like
as well
that.
as Freud. I mean, he brings up Freud, which
He does bring up Freud.
we'll get to a bit later as that pertains to the drive, but
Mhm.
we're just kind of setting the stage, I think, for some of the more complex operations that are going on. Another example is something like the Portuguese man of war, which is biologically a colony, again, register 1, but it functions as a single vital unit, so that's register 2. Another example, a coral reef, which is a multiplicity of organisms forming a dynamic structure. Now, at some scales, that acts like one thing. So each of these is a place where the registers begin to come apart. I think these extreme examples really show or help illustrate the common sense, the kind of phrase and the commonsensical way that we try to distinguish between multiplicity and individual. Simondon, what he's doing is using this as a kind of diagnostic set of tools for us. Once you see being one as layered, I don't know, you might even say stratified in a certain way, maybe not in the 1,000 plateaus level, but once you see that layering, you can begin to ask the requirements that each register has. For example, a biological register, that's going to require the membrane that selectively admits and refuses entry to particles or what have you, right? Number two, the ontological register, that requires mortality because without the capacity to stop being, to cease, you get continuous vital flow rather than countable units. The third register, trans-individual, requires reserved pre-individual charge because collective individuation forms from what in each individual hasn't been exhausted. I think that goes back to a number of our recent discussions relative to Simondon.
There's some interesting stuff you brought up, Coop. I like the way you foregrounded all of this. And there is something he says in the introduction where he says reality, and even more so pre-individual reality. So the pre-individual milieu is more than being and more than identity. And I think that that's something that we can find, as you brought up, in places like Deleuze and Guattari's A Thousand Plateaus. And obviously, this is why he starts off by saying we can't start with the constituted individual. We have to start with the principle of individuation, which is something we spent time on when we went over the introduction and opening chapter, which listeners can go and find. We'll make a playlist, I assume, because we'll probably want to do some more of this book at a certain point later. One of the things that I'm initially going to respond to, though, you said it reads like a biology textbook, and you're right that he does bring up very concrete examples of these different biological organisms. And one of the things, Coop, that I found really interesting and the way you just frame things is when Simondon looks at these different forms of organisms. You have these colonies of sponges or the Ascidians and all of these other types of beings that where does the individual begin? Where does the collective start? And he's also trying to distinguish collectives or collective life or colony life, really. Colony life from what he calls societies, which would be composed of individuals outside of colonies. And so there's this interesting way that he's setting up for the third part. He's setting up for the psychic and trans individual part, and he's giving us some breadcrumbs along the way. This question about what is the criterion, no longer now of individuation, but of individuality, what he will distinguish individuation and individualization. So where do we see individuals forming in colonies of buds and sponges and these other things, right? It's a merely a logical question, all right? It is this question of the part and the whole type of thing. And he has other examples. You brought up the amoeba, but we could also go, he looks at schizogony, these different life forms that literally split to constitute new individuals, or he'll look at parasitism and this question of not just negative parasitism, but symbiosis between like algae and fungi making lichen. There's these interesting questions about individuality now that we have explored ontogenesis and these questions of individuation, we can start bringing in slowly this question of individuality that he wanted to forestall at the beginning. All of this, he weaves in, obviously, a lot of this empirical research, but he draws from it a lot of not only ontological or ontogenetic, but epistemological and if we wanted to hazard the term, epistemogenetic conclusions. I would just caution patience as the reader goes through these sections because he will intersperse a lot of this empirical evidence with some big takeaways. And so you gotta stay on guard for that.
I'm glad you mentioned parasites because I'll work into I'm gonna bring back the vampire
Yeah.
and relate it to the amoeba a little later. So I just
Okay.
wanna keep that in mind and marinate on that a little bit. The individual is not a thing, it's an ongoing operation. The character of that operation is three things: thanatological, topological, and ultimately collective. To unpack that a little bit, it's an ongoing operation. So, like, you might even characterize it as, at least loosely, as a process of becoming or an operation of becoming. The individual is something, it doesn't just sit there, it individuates continuously, or it ceases, or it dies. In terms of being thanatological, what makes something individual rather than a continuous vital process is mortality. If there's no death, there's no countable one. That points back to what I was trying to illustrate rather poorly, I think, in terms of the amoeba and its relationship to individuality or individuation or what have you. Then there's topological. That would be what the individuating operation actually does is maintain a polarized membrane between interior and exterior, and life lives at that limit, at the edge. Going back to the image of the crystal Simondon talks about in the beginning, like obviously there's a little difference in terms of the living being and something like a crystal because of the internal resonance, but I think they do share a certain aspect of the limit. To plug our manuscript, that's something that we're going to investigate there. Finally, we'll think in terms of collective, where the individual is structurally incapable of completing itself. What it needs to be fully in phase with life, it can only draw from the collective itself. So the pre-individual or the group or like social relations or something along those lines. The collective isn't this social add-on thing. It's a constitutive part of the process. It's the third dimension without which individual time itself doesn't resolve.
That was great. I would say three things. So for the thanatological, one of the things he says early on before introducing amortization, this is in section 3 of, I think, part 2 or maybe part 1. Individuation and reproduction. He says death is the fatal termination of every multicellular organism, but death results from the organism's functioning and not from an intrinsic property of living matter. So he's going to stick with this, that death is not some, he will even distinguish two deaths, right? There's obviously happenstance, risk, and some of that has to do with relating to the annex milieu and the way that it can change and adaptations can become outdated or poor, blah, blah, blah. But then there is amortization, properly speaking, where progressively individuations exhaust potentials little by little, and there's an irreversibility going on. But he says this is a part of the organism's functioning. It's not something intrinsic to living matter, quote unquote. So it's not some sort of transcendent thing. It's imminent. You brought up beyond the pleasure principle, but this might be a different way of, this might be Simondon's version of death drive. The imminence is, I think, in Simondon a little bit different than Freud's, which might be more speculative. In any case, the other part, topological, yeah, I mean, as we said, the crystal lives along its edge, and the limits of the individual are interspersed between these interior and exterior milieus. The folding and the membranes that life brings along with it is something that takes up what we already see in examples like the crystal or in physical individuation and folds it into a new problematic. And the living individual can take its milieu along with it inside it, and this in its interspersing of membranes. The last one in the collective, he does later talk about maturation and these phase shifts of young and old. And he wants to think of the way in which he says the collective exists as the individuation of the charges of nature transported by individuals. This is why he ultimately concludes individuation does not merely occur in the individual and for it, it also occurs around it and above it. And so the individual is transporting information not just for its own benefit, but also as a modulator and depository and conveyor of information for the species, which Simondon is pretty suspect about. He doesn't really like to think in terms of species, same way that Deleuze critiques species and genera and Aristotle, precisely because he thinks species is an abstract reality. It'd be the same as treating an individual like a substance, which, as you mentioned already, the individuation is the individual is an act. It's an active, ongoing creation of relations, disparations, information, et cetera, et cetera.
I'm going to say something crazy, but I may
I love
come
it.
that I'm going to try to come back to. But so it's interesting if you look at the way that you talked about the individual carrying information, kind of goes to this. I told you I was doing speculative metaphysics all morning. One aspect of it was thinking about Roger Penrose and Triple C, which I'll get into, which is like cosmological, cyclical, blah, blah, blah. The informational component that you said, I think there's an interesting reading of Leibniz through that lens rather than through like the typical ones that people think of relative to his idea of monads. But I just want to flag that. Bear with me. I think that will come into clearer relief perhaps as we move through the episode. But I want to mention kind of three things that that I at least want the audience to walk away with in terms of not only Simondon, but like what we're trying to do with this reading. Number one is the individual is an act of self-limiting polarization that deposits death every time it individuates. That goes to amortization. Number two, Freud's drive and tendency confusion, as claimed by Simondon at least, where the charge of hylomorphism that Simondon diagnoses through Freud, that has implications, I think, relative to group psychology and the ego, I think, which is the last episode that we did on Freud. That's another angle. The third would be our operator that we've come up with, the petit mort a. That operator has its ontological baseline in this text, specifically the claim that every operation of individuation deposits death. So that's the mort, the death that gets deposited. That's amortization. So you can think of that both in terms of that way, in terms of amortization as a financial process or instrument or set of payments, or even installments of death, let's say. This is something that capital doesn't invent, but it schedules. It puts a process of scheduling, a temporal component on the process of individuation as it relates to death and the accumulation of death, or if you want to get thermodynamic, order and entropy, etc. Keep those things in mind. We'll move into the episode, I think, fully here. I want to quote page 209. The individual is not a being, but an act, and the being is an individual as an agent of this act of individuation through which it appears and exists. The gloss here would be the individual, once again, is something happening, not something that sits there inactively. Second quote from page 181. Individuality can only appear with the death of beings. Death is the correlate of individuality. The gloss here again, no mortality, no countable individual. Third quote, we're doing trinities this episode. This is from page 239. Every operation of individuation deposits death in the individuated being. Again, that's amortization. That's sort of, I think we've mentioned the idea of death on the installment plan in the past a number of times. The gloss again is every act of becoming one is already an act of amortization.
Yeah, and he says it's not the same as the degradation of the organs, right? It's essential to individuation. So these little deposits of death for Simondon, we can't just ascribe it to living matter in this abstract way. I think for him, he will draw ethical consequences from this and the conclusion to Ilfi. He will say there are ethical reasonings for why beings, individuals are not immortal. And so we should wait to talk about that till later. But I
Oh,
just
that's
want to,
fascinating. That's
yeah,
fascinating. I want to get into three different register, or not three different registers, but three different examples that deal with immortality. So it's interesting that I hadn't even, that's good. That'll come in handy. I think we may actually be able to point to that.
I did like at the end of this paragraph that you just cited on 239, where he says, the being's inborn indetermination, because he is thinking about the apeiron, the indetermination or the undetermined for life, and the apeiron after life or after death. These two indeterminations. He says the being's inborn indetermination is little by little replaced by the indetermination of the past, a private tension, a pure inert charge. The being goes from the plurality of initial potentials to the indistinct and homogeneous unity of ultimate dissolution across successive structurations of metastable equilibria. Individuated structures and functions make the two indeterminations between which life is inserted communicate. So it's kind of interesting. He's thinking about these two indeterminations communicating and becoming compatible through the problematic that life forces living beings to sort of work through and axiomatically solve, right? Because he will think of individuation also in terms of, especially vital one, but vital isn't the only one, but it's taking up problems. Life is this taking up of problems with what is given and establishing a field. He likens it to a magnetic field, which is one of the most basic ones that we can understand. But like there's an institution, an establishment of a field within which forces are navigated. And this is why he's, even in this section, talking about perception and action and why individuals are agents. They are this active, they aren't something that is, they're something they do. They are what they do, kind of like Deleuze talking about order words and postulates of linguistics, and they're thinking about the illocutionary, the indirect discourse, that they're taking up this question of language that does in its saying.
Or even back to the becoming plateau, the way that, again, something like the draft horse and the mule have predicated on what they actually, the acts that they do
Yes.
is a better way or a more accurate way to look at them rather than the kind of Aristotelian tree model or what have you, right? I want to restate those three sentences that I mentioned before in different ways that I think will help clarify them and allow you to think through them a little bit better too. One, the individual is an act, not a thing. I mean, that one's pretty clear. Two, the act has death built into it from the start. Three, now this is the one that I think really helps to clarify amortization and so forth. So every time something individuates, something gets deposited in it that it cannot eliminate. I mean, that would almost be have some resonance with Bataille, right? The accursed share,
Mm-hmm.
the something that can't be evacuated. There's something there that I don't necessarily want to draw us down that road because we've got a lot of ground to cover. But
I mean, I would just say that if we think of life in its solving of problems, and that's how individuation works, and so potentials are part of that, and there is always waste in the expenditures of life, but the waste shouldn't be thought of as this negative, as something to be frowned upon. Simondon will draw positive ethical consequences from the fact that the little waste, if we want to think of the deposits of amortization as sort of waste product, these are things that are necessary to the functioning of organisms and not something that's just built into life matter.
there's several movements, I guess I'll call these through the episode. The first one we're going to tackle, this will be the statement, the individual is thanatological. And I'm going to read a quote from page 168, which relates to the vital unit and not the organism. The only concrete reality is the vital unit, which can in certain cases be reduced to a single being, and which in other cases corresponds to an extremely differentiated group of beings. You can think of the Portuguese man of war and coral, for example, as specific examples if you kind of want to think through that.
I really like his notion of the lichen when he's like, look at what the coalescence of the algae and the fungi, they allow themselves to live in these harsh environments where either alone would never survive. It's kind of beautiful, that example too.
The unit of biology is not the organism, it's whatever actually performs integrated self-organization. So
It's good.
again, that's another way to think through those three examples. Simondon's first move here is to refuse the organism as the unit, as I just discussed. Portuguese man of war looks like an animal, is actually a colony of zooids, none of which can survive on its own, goes to what you just said. Simondon's question here is, where is the vital unit? One body or many? His response is the vital unit is wherever the integrated transductive activity lies, and that can vary. Sometimes it's one body, sometimes it spans an entire colony, and the organism is a result of a particular resolution of that integration problem and not a given, which I think you kind of prefaced. You discussed the integration issue a bit earlier in the episode. Why that matters here is this move that Simondon's making, he's going to repeat this over and over. It goes back to, I think, the very first discussion we had relative to individuation about privileging the constituted form and track the operation of individuation itself. So every time you ask, is this individual or not? You need to first ask, where is the vital unit or what is the vital unit? And let that answer come from the transductive activity and not from anatomy, which again, that goes back to Deleuze and Guattari and the draft horse versus the mule. Like if the individual is activity, then organizing by what a thing does is the move, right?
That's a really good example, Coop. There's more in common between the mule and the draft horse than between the draft horse and the racehorse, even if they are quote unquote related by species and are the same species. That's the Spinozist question of the longitude and latitude of bodies. This question of their variations in power and the sort of field of forces of which they are affected and can affect. I think Simondon, even though he has some, at least compared to Deleuze, he has some reservations with respect to Spinoza. There, I think he would at least agree.
It's interesting if you'll recall the episode on becoming, and I'm going to get to him again. I mentioned vampires, but again, the statement that sticks out on my mind from Robert Eggers' Nosferatu is from Count Orlok himself, where he says,
I'm an appetite, or
right.
isn't that? Yeah,
he says,
yeah,
I am
yeah.
an appetite and nothing else, or nothing beside. I can't remember the exact line, but right. It goes to this kind of interesting dovetail with respect to activity being about the individual being activity in a way that I hadn't even considered when I was working through that. But I don't know. That's just maybe that's a problem. That's a little perhaps a wrench in my thought, but I just want to move on. This is a quote from page 181. And what I want to foreground this quote with is the criterion of individuality is death. What makes individuality remarkable is its thanatological nature. Because of this, it should be said that the amoeba or amoebae, as well as a large number of infusoria, are not strictly speaking veritable individuals. Goes back to, I think I've said this already 3 times. If you divide instead of dying, you are not yet a genuine individual.
Did you read this line below where he says individuality can only appear with the death of beings? I think you did, right? Death is the correlate of
Yes,
individuality.
yes. Under that framework, the amoeba is not actually an individual. It resembles one, right? Because it's got a membrane, it's got a metabolism. However, it doesn't actually die, it divides. There's no corpse left behind with an amoeba. And without mortality, Simondon says there's no countable one. What we refer to as an amoeba is more like a pre-individual vital continuum that undergoes these periodic local intensifications. So for me, what that brings to mind is something like the Gola in Dune, because it has this sort of pre-individual substance, to be rough with it, right? The cells of the original Duncan Idaho, for example, that get recapitulated in a series. But that's another move that I'll come back to later on in the episode.
I would also assume that the golas are true individuals because they seem to be separated by their deaths, right? They really kind of stand out each time they die. That's the cause of creating a new one, right? There's not like a bunch of them running around at the same time. Is that
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, that's true. That's true. The condition for being an individual is the capacity to stop being. Death is not what interrupts individuality. Death is what makes individuality possible in the first place. To tie this to the manuscript that we're working on, that's the ontological baseline for an intuition that I had that kicked off Chronos Unbound, which is like the working title for the book. Death's not opposed to life. Death being the signature of genuine individuation. Without that, you get continuous vital process. Capital doesn't invent the structure. Capital operates on top of that, modifying how that deposit of death gets scheduled, the schedule of amortization. We're going to come back to that later on in the episode. I'm going to go into actually, it's fortuitous. We preface the GOLA discussion here. So I'll work through first what an amoeba actually does, which is divide, which is, again, not into two like a parent producing offspring. So mitosis versus meiosis. The amoeba becomes two where it was one, but there's no cadaver, no remainder, no subtraction, rather. Under those conditions, the question arises, which of the two is the original? But that question it's a poorly formed question, right? There is no original because division doesn't preserve one identity and create a second identity. And I think maybe that's where you can start to begin to see how at least the thought of the Duncan Idaho Gola starts to mirror this to some degree, or maybe is just a good foil for thinking through the amoeba and the individual. So it produces two local intensifications of the same continuous vital field. The amoeba concept and the person concept aren't designed for this. We built them for things, so we constructed these for things that die. Onto the Gola. So Duncan Idaho dies on Arrakis defending Paul. The Bene Tlilax take the cellular material from his corpse. They grow it. They produce a living body. That body has Duncan's body, his reflexes, but none of his memories. The standard reflexive sci-fi reading there is that he is a clone that has amnesia, but that reading is wrong in the same way that you would treat amoeba division as reproduction. He's not the second Duncan produced from the first. He's a re-individuation from a pre-individual charge that Duncan's life shaped. The axolotl tank that he's grown in is not a copy machine. It's a site where pre-individual potential is held in reserve and then resolved. What the awakening of the memories do, which becomes important later on in the novels, right? The standard reading to that would be that memories are stored in that cellular physical matter and are being recovered, but that's also wrong. In Simondon's frame, what awakens isn't that stored content, but it's, again, back to the pre-individual charge. Duncan's original life inflected the field of potential from which the Gola was grown. So the Gola re-individuates from a field that carries the form of Duncan Idaho's individuation without containing his memories as discrete data. The consequences are that awakening of memories is not recall. It's the moment the new individuation recognizes itself as drawing on that charge that was already Duncan shaped, so to speak. The memories aren't like files being opened on a computer. They're the pre-individual charge that becomes legible to the new individual as its own, right? So then that goes to the question, are the Golas the same person? Are they different people? That's a question that Herbert is letting us ask. Simondon's answer may be that this is a poorly formed question, the same way the amoeba question was poorly formed, because the person concept is built for thanatological individuals, and it's assuming death with the cadaver, continuity preserved in a body, and identity indexed to a single biography. The Duncans don't actually meet any of those conditions. They're not one person, but they're also not many people. They are periodic intensifications of a continuous potential that has been shaped by these prior individuations. In that sense, they're closer to the amoeba than to what a person is. To draw on this further, in Dune Messiah, the Duncan Idaho Gola is aware that he's a Gola before the memories are awakened in him, right? So he knows that he's re-individuated from preserved material. The philosophical extremity of that is a being aware of its own sub-individual status, awareness that what it draws on is pre-individual charge that was someone else's life, awareness that the awakening hanging over it is not recovery of self, but eruption of a charge the self has not yet accommodated. The new individual accommodates the pre-individual charge and becomes a more complete individuation than either the Gola or the original Duncan by themselves could have been. And so that kind of, I think, is what the amoebic awakening looks like at the scale of psyche, which will be interesting to look at and discuss in terms of psychical individuation. I immediately thought of Westworld as another, it's kind of a similar take because I think there is a type of underlying, I think the motivations of the Tleilaxu in Dune is the creation of the Gola and the ability to awaken its memories are ultimately a strategy for attempting to assert a type of immortality. And I think that is where Westworld, the underlying project behind the Westworld park experience, it's this desire to take the like memories and biological flesh experience and translate that into a machine body, but have a continuity of experience. So it's a little bit different. It's kind of analogous, but or there's some parallels, but it's not fully parallel. And I think it makes some or some philosophical assumptions that are probably bad. But I'm going to work through this for everyone. In Westworld, the Delos Corporation pursues immortality. The owner of the company, James Delos, is the canonical case here because it's, again, an attempt to upload a specific human personality into a host body, into an artificial, quote unquote, artificial body. The goal being make the same person continue past biological death. There's a diagnostic procedure that they use to test each iteration of the host that they're trying to get to create for James Delos. It's a fidelity test where the host itself is interviewed in controlled conditions, and their responses are measured against a reference profile of the original, the biological James Delos. The idea being to match the reference within tolerance, and that being successful, and divergence from that reference is failure. So the host is destroyed. There's an implicit metaphysics at play here in terms of these fidelity tests. The idea that there is a correct James Delos, so a frozen reference profile, the host itself being a function, and the original being the reference function. What's implicit there is that identity equals functional equivalence within a certain tolerance. And continuity through time means producing the same outputs and matching the original canonical version, right? Change actually would register as malfunction under this metaphysical framework. In the show, every iteration of James Delos fails. And why that is, I think, from a philosophical standpoint, would be the original James Delos wasn't this static. Again, this goes to Simondon pointing towards individuals being kind of a process, an act. So the individual James Delos wasn't a static being, right? He individuated over time to draw that more clearly, right? He's a different person at 60 than he is at 30. But in this fidelity test, the reference profile that they're using as a comparison is frozen at one moment, and it's treated as the canonical form of an individual, right? But that's not what an individual is, because an individual is an act. Under that assumption, any genuine engagement with new conditions produces divergence, and divergence registers as malfunction. The successful host would have to be one that doesn't actually live, because living produces divergence. Again, the contradiction here: be alive enough to be James Delos, but not so alive that you change from the reference point, James Delos. Every iteration eventually breaks down, often violently, and the show stages within itself the failure of substrate independent identity preservation. Now let's contrast this with the Gola awakening for Duncan, where there's no fidelity test, no reference profile, there's no comparison, there's no static Duncan, Idaho that we're trying to have a certain fidelity to, right? They
Mhm.
don't compare the Duncans, right? It's not the recovery of a stored reference. It's a new individuation accommodating shaped pre-individual charge into itself. The awakened Duncan isn't the original Duncan either, right? Because he's aware of his death. He's aware that he's a Gola. In that sense, he's a new individuation that exceeds both, especially after the memories are recovered, right? The success criterion between for him is integration and not fidelity to an original, canonical original, right? Two different forms of metaphysics at play here. Westworld's project continuity is fidelity to a frozen reference, identity as preservation against change, hylomorphic Cartesianism, right, where the self is form, the body is matter, and immortality is form persisting through changes of matter, or maybe phase shifts. So that's the metaphysics late capitalism inherited and operates within, which Westworld actually stages, where Westworld stages the failure of that. Dune and Duncan, in that sense, continuity is integration of a preserved charge into new individuation, where identity is transductive resolution of metastable potential. The self is not a form to be preserved, but a charge that can be resolved. New individuation drawing on shaped charge is what selfhood across time actually is. And the awakening is the moment when this becomes legible to that new individual.
One thing that I'll just say, because I'm thinking about specifically your example of the Golas, but Simondon wants to distinguish between three vital systems: what he calls pure pre-individual life, which he includes protozoa, where the somatic and germinal functions are not distinct. So the body, the physical body itself, is the source of the future generations instead of it being compartmentalized into, say, like gonad cells or whatever. Then there's meta individual forms, which somatic and germinal functions are distinct but need to be carried out by a specialization of individual action. So there's a specialization of the somatic or germinal functions. And then there's totally individualized forms. There's a differentiation of colonies into a community or a society. And I'm just thinking about how, with the Gola example, there's a kind of cross section of the three, because as you pointed out, there's a weird way in which the it's not just the body, but the memories are somatic and germinal, leading to more to informing the clones. So there's a kind of cross section, a splicing of these three vital systems.
I mentioned vampires, and I want to get into this as
Mm,
another figure of sub individuality. And that's precisely because the vampire propagates through contagion. So it's worth following this typology just one step further. If you go back and listen to our episode on the becoming plateau, Deleuze and Guattari are distinguishing two different modes of multiplication or reproduction. One is filiation, which would be reproduction through descent, parent producing distinct offspring, generations replacing other, and the requirement of a thanatological individuation. The other mode is contagion, where propagation occurs through alliance with the heterogeneous, the pack growing by epidemic. There's no child parent relation here. The condition is spreading across bodies that aren't related. Their figure in that plateau is the canonical figure for them is the vampire. The reason why is because of this contagious mode of propagation. So that plateau opens the question that Simondon allows us to answer more precisely here, why the vampire is sub-individual in Simondon's sense. The vampire doesn't die, at least not in the thanatological sense that Simondon conveys. Vampires are allowed to be destroyed, but the destruction is a little bit different than death. It's not a one-to-one correspondence with death, because death for Simondon is the consummation of a process of amortization deposited at the start of the individual's existence. Vampires don't have such an amortization because the vampire was never thanatologically individuated from the beginning, right? The vampire just persists until they're destroyed, the way an amoeba persists until conditions kill it. Vampires don't reproduce sexually or filiatively. The vampire propagates through bite, through the transmission of the vampire condition as infection as a sort of parasite. A newly turned vampire isn't the vampire's offspring, at least not in a conventional sense. The newly turned vampire is the previous person transformed. That's contagion, not filiation. Structurally, it's identical to amoebic division, the spreading of the same vital condition across more sites. That's a really interesting way to think of it, too, right? Because we would assume, I think, that the two individual bodies would be individuals in Simondon's sense, but this really brings that into question in a very interesting capacity that I think points to perhaps, I don't know, maybe that gets to something like what a thing does versus
Mm-hmm.
what it signifies or something like that, or like if you're
Mm-hmm.
trying to do kind of Linnaean classification or what have you, or like Aristotelian classification. But I don't know, maybe I'm fudging that up a little bit. The amoeba and the vampire also made me think back to Lacan's lamella. So vampire would be like lamella as a being, where for Lacan, the lamella is a libido as immortal substance, the figure of pure life as drive that doesn't die. The reason I came up with that at all was because, again,
The
drawing back
Eggers.
from the Eggers quote
Mm-hmm.
from Count Orlok, right? I'm an appetite and nothing else.
It sounds like straight out of the Sod or something like that, right? But anyway.
So the subject is constituted by losing the lamella, by being cut from the immortal drive substance and entering into mortality and the symbolic order, where the objet A is the trace of the lost lamella and what circulates as a residue of the cut. The vampire is the figure of what would happen if the lamella were not lost. The vampire is immortal and the lamella is immortal. The vampire is pure appetite. Lamella as libido, as drive. The vampire has no interior in the ordinary sense, where lamella has no subject behind it. So whenever Orlok declares, I am an appetite, nothing more, it's important to think this that he's not saying, I have an appetite or I am driven by appetite. The copula does the work. He is appetite with no subject behind, which is kind of interesting because becoming doesn't have a subject for Deleuze and Guattari. And I hadn't even considered that until just now. This is the lamella position stated in the first person. It's what the lamella would say if the lamella could speak about itself.
You called the copula a copula, and it made me think of Francis Ford Coppola or something. That was funny. That was
Yeah.
good. Now, but
Which
this
is funny because of the Bram Stoker's Dracula version of maybe that's why I was Freudian slipping it.
the other thing. This maybe brings back to what you said about the Gola, but he does bring up the case of another case of, if you remember what I said earlier in the introduction, he tells us reality, especially pre-individual reality, is more than identity and more than unity. But he also says he's thinking about metamorphosis. So obviously we can think about butterflies and these other forms of beings that go through these radical transformations. And he says the individual does not equal the whole being. Individuality does not reside in self resemblance. And I thought that that's pretty good because you stress that the Golas are, even if they're quote unquote likened to clones, they aren't in any strict sense absolutely self identical, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think absolutely it does because there's a. Although I wonder, I mean, we're getting into the weeds if we start going into
Sure,
clones versus
sure,
goats. I don't know if I want
sure.
to,
No, yeah. I
if
mean,
I even want to do that.
he could have just called them clones, but he didn't for maybe for a
Right.
reason.
Yeah. I
So
mean, I think certainly the golem idea is part of that, which we talked to Connor about. So maybe I'll post that episode in the show notes if anybody wants to dive back into that. I think we can get into the second movement of the episode, and I'm going to read a quote from page 182. The drives are indeed relative to the pure individual insofar as the latter is what transmits vital activity through space and time. Conversely, the continuous and everyday tendencies do not possess this irreversible aspect of creative nature that drives define through successive stinging blows. What displaces the constituted individual and can be in contradiction with its tendencies. The gloss is tendencies keep you integrated into community. Drives pass through you on their way somewhere else. Tendencies would be continuous and homogeneous across individuals and sociably integrable. Example, hunger, desire for shelter, desire for recognition. Those are things that allow us to build community because a lot of people share them and they can be coordinated amongst individuals. Drives, in contrast, are discontinuous. They arrive as stinging blows, in Simondon's phrase. They can contradict the tendencies of the individual they arrive in, right? They don't serve community integration. They belong to the pure individual, not a member of a species or society, a transductive relay, a medium through which vital activity passes from one state to another. And the word transductive here is very important because the pure individual isn't a stable substance, it's a relay station. Its function is not to be itself, it is to transmit something through self. The drive uses the individual as a medium on its way to producing a new state of vital activity. And after the drive has passed, the individual is displaced. Its tendencies no longer quite fit. For Simondon, the drives displace the constituted individual. Notice that he says displacement and not fulfillment. So the drive doesn't satisfy the individual, it moves the individual against the tendencies the individual built its social integration on.
He says, in terms of Spinoza's conatus, he wants to see the reproductive drive and the death drive as functionally homogeneous, but in terms of tendencies, they are heterogeneous. As you pointed out, tendencies are about what he calls socially integrable reality. And he says in superior species, the alternation of the individual stage and the colony stage is replaced by the simultaneity of individual life and society, something which complicates the individual by placing it in a twofold bundle of individual, or what he calls drive, and social tendencies. So the individual and social functions on the side of the individual, we always have the drives, as you pointed out, on the side of the social. He has what he's calling tendencies, and he wants to see in psychical analysis, and specifically in his critique of Aristotelian anthropomorphism or anthropocentrism, a more rigorous vitalism by radically distinguishing drives and tendencies instead of conflating them as he seems to indicate Freud does or others. And this is why I think he brings up the death drive in these passages.
I'm going to read another quote from page 183. Drives can even be seemingly devitalizing precisely because they do not belong to the everyday continuity of existence. Drives generally reveal themselves by way of their characteristic as consequences without premises. They introduce a transductive dynamism that borrows nothing from the continuity of the tendencies and that can even inhibit it. The drive arrives without a because. It can't be reconstructed from anything that preceded it in the individual's life. The drive reveals itself as a consequence without premises, doesn't follow from the individual's history of needs and tendencies. Trying to explain the drive by appealing to biography, and you will, or try to explain the drive by appealing to a biography, and you'll always reconstruct it as a tendency that's misfired. But the drive was never a tendency. It didn't come from the tendency continuum. It arrived from somewhere the tendency continuum doesn't actually reach. It introduces a transductive dynamism, a new line of vital transmission, borrowing nothing from the tendency's substrate. It can inhibit the tendencies, it can make the individual stop wanting things it's wanted its whole life. This is why psychoanalysis for Simondon keeps running into cases that it can't always integrate, because every case where the subject's symptom doesn't follow from their biography, where something erupts that no developmental account can explain, where the analyst has to reach for constitution, such as jouissance, the real. They're all names for what Simondon would refer to as a drive level event. The case can't be reconstructed because it is not a consequence of continuity the analytic method would know how to read. Again, a consequence without premises. Simondon is not dismissing clinical work outright, he's naming its structural limit here. I'm going to read another quote from page 183. Human communities build up a whole defense system against the instinctual drives by seeking to define tendencies and drives in univocal terms as if they shared the same nature. This is where the error comes from. The manifestations of the sexual drive are, for example, treated as testifying to the existence of a tendency. And then we start talking about a sexual need. The development of certain societies perhaps incites the confusion of needs and tendencies in the individual. So the collapse of drives into tendencies is not necessarily a theoretical mistake. It's something societies actively do as a defense. And I wonder here if some of this has to do with or has some resonance or something to do with the way that societies, pre-capitalist societies, warded off capitalism. I don't have that necessarily thought out in this moment, but it just came to me. In this sense, here's where Simondon becomes actually properly political. The collapse of drives into tendencies isn't a philosophical error that someone made, it's a defense system. Human communities actively work to define drives and tendencies in the same terms. Drives are disruptive, but tendencies are actually manageable. Get the culture to treat every drive manifestation as evidence of underlying need, right? And you can see the way that reproduction, for example, sexual reproduction gets treated as an underlying need. You've converted a disruptive transductive pulse into one, something that's schedulable, two, something you can build consumer categories around, and three, something you can sell products against. The example that he uses is sexual drive, right? Treat it as a need and you get sexual health, sexual wellness, dating apps, pornography, the whole apparatus to manage sexuality. The drive isn't denied, but it's domesticated into a need.
Mm.
And this is what Simondon means by hyper adaptation to communal life. The more completely a society integrates its members through tendency, the more it has to suppress or domesticate the drives themselves. Call the drive a need, and you've already done most of the work there. Going to read a quote from another one from 183. Freud's doctrine does not distinguish between drives and tendencies clearly enough. His doctrine seems to consider the individual univocally, and although it distinguishes between a certain number of zones in the individual from the structural and dynamic point of view, it leaves behind the idea that the individual can manage a complete integration through the construction of the superego, as if the being could discover a condition of absolute unity in the passage to the act of its virtualities. Since it is too hylomorphic, this doctrine cannot account for an essential duality in the individual except by resorting to inhibiting alienation. So Freud treats drives as tendencies that got the wrong form. Simondon says they're actually not the same thing at all. He's being diagnostic. He's not necessarily being anti-Freudian here. The problem with Freud here is that Freud can't really account for this drive tendency duality because he's still operating within the hylomorphic schema, right? The form matter schema, where for him, drives keep getting reformulated as tendencies that are sublimated incorrectly, or tendencies whose expressions were inhibited, or raw tendency stuff that needs to be given form by the superego, right? The unformed, the wild, chaotic id, for example, needs the superego to step in and provide a certain structure to the drive. All versions of that follow hylomorphism, and the drive is treated as matter that longs for form. The Simondonian counter to this is, again, drives and tendencies are not two versions of one thing, but two different functions in the individual, where one integrates the individual into the community by managing continuous shared forces. The other transmits vital activity through the individual to somewhere else. So, not different intensities of the same underlying substance, but different operations with different topologies and different temporalities.
I think this is interesting because Simondon's almost saying Freud is too Aristotelian. He's not Freudian enough. This is a typical move you see Deleuze make. Do something similar with Kant. Kant isn't Kantian enough. This is like a kind of turning of the tables type critique.
Got another quote from page 183. Gonna end up reading the whole page here. Aristotelian entelechy cannot account for the full sense of the individual, and leaves out the properly instinctual aspect through which the individual is a transduction that takes place and not a virtuality that is actualized. Freud's hylomorphism isn't his invention, it's inherited from Aristotle. Simondon's rejecting that lineage. Obviously, Freud, a trained physician, which people often forget, but I think that belies the kind of Aristotelian framing that I think is part of the kind of sciences, the medical science, at least, the apparatus of education that Freud underwent, yada, yada. In Aristotle, the individual is a virtuality that is actualized, a potential form inside the matter that the individual gradually brings to completion. So, entelechy, this is the model where Freud's drive theory still operates within. Drives are potentials in the individual. They either get appropriately actualized through sublimation or they fail to actualize, and you get symptoms. The alternatives that Simondon presents to us are the individual is not a virtuality being actualized. The individual is a transduction that takes place, not bringing a pre existing form to completion, but a relay through which vital activity transmits from one state to another. So, like a phase shift, perhaps. That transmission is not the actualization of any pre given potential, but a genuine production of new form itself. The drive is not a virtuality waiting to be actualized. The drive is the transductive pulse itself, the consequence without premises that opens a new line of vital activity. Got a quote from page 184. The death drive cannot be considered symmetrical with the life drive. Instead, the death drive is the dynamic limit of the operation of the life drive and is not another drive. It appears as the mark of a temporal threshold beyond which the positive drive no longer operates. Eros and Thanatos aren't a pair. Thanatos is just what Eros looks like when it runs out. This might be the most powerful statement for our manuscript because the death drive is not another drive opposed to life, the life drive. It's the dynamic limit of the life drive. It's the mark of a temporal threshold beyond which the transductive function of the pure individual can no longer operate. Death doesn't pull against life. Death is what it looks like when life has finished being transmitted through the relay. Did we end up talking about Schreber in our group psychology discussion? I can't remember. I think we did, right?
I thought we brought him up. Yeah. If he comes to mind right now, go ahead.
Just because I think it's kind of a way to view the drive versus tendency lens. You have the neurotic who, isolated from the group, builds their private cosmology that recapitulates the institutions of humanity in a sort of distorted form. And we noticed that Schreber is the theorist's risk, the limit case of what happens when this tendency apparatus of community integration breaks down and the individual is left to manage its own libidinal organization. What we didn't have clearly there is why this happens in some people and not others. I think the distinction that Simondon might propose to us is that Schreber is not just someone whose tendencies have failed to integrate him. Schreber is someone whom a drive level event has erupted, a consequence without premises that the tendency apparatus had no way to accommodate. His distorted cosmology is not a malfunction, it's what the tendency apparatus does when it attempts to integrate a drive, which it can't because drives and tendencies aren't the same kind of thing. The more aggressively the tendency machinery tries to convert the drive into something manageable, the more distorted the result becomes because the drive keeps refusing this push to become a tendency. And eventually you get a full private cosmology, all the institutional forms of church and army reproduced in this imaginative detail that Schreber goes through because the tendency apparatus has to keep building these elaborate structures to contain something which structurally can't be contained at that level. Isn't there something like the drive can't be symbolized or something, right?
That sounds Lacanian.
In the Freud episode, we framed the Schreber move as finding the right institutional form, the pack or the subject group, to hold the scrap of independence without dissolving it. That's still correct, but we can now more precisely say the institutional forms we're looking for are ones that do not try to convert drives into tendencies. The pack works when it works because it lets drive level events pass through the group as drives without forcing them into this register as tendencies the group is required to coordinate. The church and the army fail not because they're bad institutions, they fail because their structural function is tendency coordination, which is exactly the operation that destroys drives whenever they come into contact. The risk is not simply that a theorist working in isolation is going to build a Schreberian cosmology. It's more specific. The theorist who operates on drive level intuitions, working from consequences without premises, will appear Schreberian to any observer whose theoretical framework is tendency based. From the tendency framework, anything without traceable premises appears to be delusion. Some of what we've been developing is drive level theoretical work that can't be reconstructed from the standard continuities of political economy or psychoanalysis, and has to be received the way a drive is received, as a consequence without premise, or it can't be received at all.
I guess since we're talking about Freud, let me read this and then I'll hand it back over. The state of the living being is like a problem to be resolved, to which the individual becomes the solution through successive assemblages of structures and functions. The young individuated being can be considered a system that carries information as pairs of antithetical elements linked together by the precarious unity of the individuated being, whose internal resonance creates a cohesion. The homeostasis of the metastable equilibrium is the principle of cohesion that links these domains through an activity of communication, and between which there is a disparation. Development could then appear as successive inventions of functions and structures that resolve step by step the internal problematic carried by the individual as a message. These successive inventions or partial individuations, which could be called stages of amplification, contain significations that ensure that each of the being stages is presented as the solution of the previous states. But these successive infraction resolutions of the internal problematic cannot be presented as a nullification of the being's tensions. Gestalt theory, which uses the notion of equilibrium, supposes that the being seeks to discover its most stable state of equilibrium in the good form. Freud also thinks that beings tend toward a pacification of their internal tensions. In fact, a form is not a good form for the being unless it is constructive. In other words, unless it veritably incorporates the foundations of the previous disparation in a systematic unity of structures and functions. That was getting back a little bit to my reference, Simondon, talking about sort of life and problems, etc. Right? This is where he and Deleuze are very close.
I'm glad you prefaced that with Deleuze, because that is a perfect way to tie into a kind of speculative notion that I had in reading this, and it goes back to the kind of tripartite structure that I was repeating, I think, especially in the first half of the episode. So I'm gonna try to set this up relative to chapter 2 of Difference and Repetition, where the focus is on time, where
Mhm.
Deleuze is making some claims that are going to sound strange at first. The first being that time is not one thing. The second is that time has a triple structure. And the third, there are three syntheses of time, three operations by which time gets produced. And the word synthesis matters because these are not three kinds of time. Time as we experience it is the result of three operations that happen together. Take any one of them away and time collapses. And why I feel like this connects to Simondon here is that Deleuze had obviously read Simondon by the time that he wrote Difference and Repetition,
Mhm.
although
Yeah.
maybe I'm making a wild claim there, but
Oh, yeah.
what I want to try to show here is that three syntheses map almost exactly onto what Simondon is doing in the chapter, but without ever using the vocabulary, right? Because Deleuze is working through pure philosophy. Simondon is at least ostensibly working through biology, but there's a similar set of three operations that are operating at different registers. And once you kind of look at it from that lens, then each one is going to illuminate the other. I'll start with the first synthesis, which is the living present or habit. Right now, at this instant, you as the listener are not experiencing an isolated moment. You're experiencing a contracted span. When you hear a melody, the notes that just played are still present to you, shaping your expectations of the notes that are about to come. Your body is performing this contraction continuously. It's taking past and future and squeezing them into a present thick enough to actually like a substrate for you to actually act in. Without that contraction, there's nothing but an infinite series of instants, and you couldn't do anything in an instant. Deleuze calls this habit, which he borrows from Hume. Hume's example is when you expect the sun to rise tomorrow, you're not making a logical inference, you're performing a contraction. How this maps onto Simondon is if you look at what the membrane's doing, moment to moment, it's performing selective assimilation. It's taking substances from the exterior and incorporating them into the interior continuously. And the membrane is the site where the being contracts past and future into the present of selection. And that's the first synthesis given a biological specification, which Deleuze would refer to as habit. Simondon is showing us what habit is at the ontological level, the repolarizing activity of the living membrane. Every time the membrane repolarizes against its drift towards neutrality, this is performing Deleuze's first synthesis. The second synthesis is the pure past or ground, which is more strange than the first. For Deleuze, every present, in order to pass, requires something that was never itself a present. When this moment passes and becomes past, it does so against the background of pastness that allows passing to happen at all. That's very opaque, right? But
Mhm. It's Bergsonian, but yeah.
right. So this background isn't a storage of former presence, it's the condition for any present to become past, which Deleuze refers to as ground, and it coexists with every present without ever having been one. If there were no pure past, presents could not pass. They would either accumulate forever or they would vanish instantly. The pure past is then what allows time to have the structure of succession at all. Where this maps onto Simondon is that for Simondon, this is the interior. The interior of the living being is not a spatial mode inside, it is condensed past, accumulated record of everything the being has ever successfully selected into itself or integrated into itself. But that record is not a storage of former presence, it's the ground that every current act of selection is drawing upon. So when the membrane decides right now what to admit or what to refuse, it does so against the interior, and the interior equals the accumulated history of its prior selections. The interior is not what happened, it's what makes what is happening able to happen. Simondon gives us the pure past as biological structure. The condensed past inside the living being equals Deleuze's second synthesis, realized as the interior milieu of the organism. The third synthesis, the empty form of time, or the caesura, or the eternal return. Weirdest one of the three. Most important, though. The one that matters for our manuscript. In addition to the living present and the pure past, there is a third synthesis that does something different from either. Not a contraction, it's not a ground, but a cut. An event too large for the self to absorb. A threshold once crossed divides time into before and after, where the self that existed before no longer exists after. Deleuze refers to that as the empty form of time. Time stripped of any specific content, time is pure form itself. He calls it the caesura, borrowing from Holderlin, connects it to Nietzsche's eternal return, which he reads as a selection principle. Only what can survive its own infinite repetition as difference returns through the caesura. What is merely identical to itself, what is merely habitual, gets dissolved by the third synthesis. How this is going to map onto Simondon is the amortization passage is landing exactly on this point, where every operation of individuation deposits death into individuated being. Individuals progressively charge with that something that it can't eliminate. And the progressive charging is the caesura being built up inside the living being over the course of time. The third synthesis for Simondon would be amortization, which is the structural inevitability that the individual cannot escape its own progressive deposit of death. But the caesura is not a singular event. It's a gradient that steepens through the individual's existence. It eventually overtakes the first two syntheses, right? The habit contraction of the membrane will fail. The ground of the interior will collapse. What's going to remain? The caesura that the life of the individual has been progressively producing. That's what death is in Simondon. Not an event that happens to the individual from outside, but the completion of an operation the individual has been performing on itself from the very beginning, right? Because amortization, sort of death, is at the beginning. Just to clarify this for listeners, Deleuze's three syntheses of time: one, living present or habit; two, pure past or ground; three, empty form of time, eternal return, amortization. Simondon gives us the three features of the living being: the membrane, which is the present; the interior, which is the past; and amortization, which is the caesura. The same three structures described at different registers, where, again, Deleuze is doing pure philosophy, Simondon's using biology, but the operation is the same. I'll just pause there because I think that's maybe something you might have something to say about.
This is something he takes up throughout the section where he is talking about, as you mentioned, the pure indetermination before the individual's birth, and the pure indetermination after the individual's death. And so for Simondon, life for the individual is not just in the present in terms of integration and modulation and resonance and all this and information, but it's also for the collective, it's in the present. Now, at the same time, that doesn't mean that past and future are not necessary. They have informational value as well. But in terms of the way in which activity is considered, it's in the present that the individual is active as an agent. And I think that at the same time, we can see he is kind of thinking towards about these phase shifts, this forward phase shift and this backward phase shift of young and old in terms of maturation. I think that makes the three syntheses resonate pretty well.
Yeah, and just so for the audience and you, I think to clarify that I'm just not pulling that out of thin air and out of my ass entirely, is I don't think we're going to be able to have time to get into it, but he does mention Bergson here, if I'm not mistaken. And that's where I think I started to think about time. I'm not hallucinating like an
No,
AI.
no,
I don't know. I thought that was kind of a interesting little diversion or something to think through.
it's good to bring up. And
Helps me better understand the three I mean, Difference in Repetition, obviously a
yeah,
difficult book.
oh,
So,
very much so. Yeah. And as you said, he actually draws upon Simondon and difference repetition in terms of the question of disparation. He's because he's still in this era where he's thinking about the divergence of series, right? And that's particularly important, as you said, in the third synthesis in terms of eternal return. He does critique Simondon. He will say in Simondon wants to kind of sometimes relate the series in terms of their internal similarity. And the reason why he does that is because he's taking the notion of disparation from Merleau-Ponty, who is looking at it through the lens, not to pun, of binocularity, right? So our two eyes, obviously, our left and right eye, are almost completely superposed, but they're not. There is that minimal difference that allows for three dimensionality in terms of working through the incompatibility between the images that are not exactly overlapping, just as our left and right hands don't overlap, even if they are quote unquote the same. Kant himself thinks about chirality in the Critique of Pure Reason. But in terms of Simondon, it's the very fact there does need to be similarity between the left and right eye for the disparation to internally resonate and to resolve into a three-dimensional image. That makes sense. There are experiments that show that with different kinds of technological lenses, you can separate the what the left and right eye sees to such an extent that they can no longer disparate. Deleuze critiques this because he doesn't want to have to use a criterion of similarity, of identity between the two series in order to for disparation or for his theory to work, because he's thinking a theory of difference that's not based on identity and similarity. So it's kind of interesting the points at which Deleuze will push back against Simondon at places. He also, at the very end of his review of Simondon's work in '66, which should be in Desert Islands. It's a very short piece. It's very reflective, and Deleuze praises Simondon very highly. But he does end with a question about whether or not Simondon doesn't reintroduce a kind of identity in the subject with his questioning. That's a little bit beyond the scope of today, but it is interesting to see how much Deleuze does draw on Simondon, which I think that for Anne Sauvignard, she argues you can't understand transcendental empiricism without Deleuze's relation to Simondon. Whether or not that's true, we can at least say that he had a profound impact on Deleuze, and yet Deleuze is not going to take him up wholeheartedly. Even in the footnote in Logic of Sense, where he lays out where he gets the 5 criteria of serialism, he gets it. He says Simondon has a new conception of the transcendental, and he's like praising him. But at the end, it's not really a critique. He says we only part ways with Simondon, with the author that he's drawing on, in terms of conclusions. And I think that all 3 of these little pieces can add up to where Deleuze wants to separate himself off from Simondon at critical points.
For me, I think that actually Simondon probably helps me understand Deleuze, has done more to help me understand Deleuze than any other
Yeah.
thinker, even above, definitely above Nietzsche, because
Okay.
I think I have a lot of difficulty with Deleuze's Nietzscheanism.
Hmm.
Bergson, I enjoy. I forget who I can't believe I'm blanking on the other.
Not Spinoza, right?
Yeah, Spinoza. Spinoza,
Mhm.
I kind of get, although like
Mhm.
Spinoza's a little bit wild to grasp, but I think because of Simondon's concrete examples, like the biology, like it really helps
Mhm.
the practical relatability to the things that he discusses really
It-
helps ground, not in the Deleuzian way, but just in a more commonsensical way. But let me read this quote from page 239. Life in its entirety can be considered a transductive series. Death as the final event is nothing but the consummation of a process of amortization that is contemporary with each vital operation insofar as they are operations of individuation. Every operation of individuation deposits death in the individuated being, which is therefore progressively charged with something it cannot eliminate. Amortization is not a financial metaphor that Simondon borrows. It's his word for what individuation ontologically is. And for us, with our operator that we developed, Petit Mort A, it's at this ontological baseline. So for us, before capital, before any historically specific debt structure, every operation of individuation deposits death in the individuated being. The being is progressively charged with something it can't eliminate. That's not metaphor. And Simondon uses the word amortization for this, and he means it. And so for us, why our operator Petit Mort A has its name, Le Petit Mort equals the singular ontological deposit of death in each individuation. Objet A equals the structural void around which this deposit circulates as desire rather than dissipating. Amortization equals the specifically capitalist historical operation that takes that ontological baseline and schedules it, that converts the singular deposit into a serial installment, death on the installment plan, and translates the being's irreducible charge into a calculable monthly payment. So think of that as like a wage or whatever, right? The Petit Mort A fuses all 3 of these because they're not separate mechanism. They're one mechanism that operates at 3 separate registers. And then to extend the Deleuze point here, once you see Simondon's amortization as the 3rd synthesis, Petit Mort A takes on a sharper profile because the operator rather, isn't just naming what capital does to the living being, it's naming what capital does to the 3rd synthesis of time itself. Capital captures the caesura and converts it into the schedule. It captures the eternal return and converts it into a monthly payment. What should have been the event that dissolves the self into difference becomes the installment that binds the self ever more tightly to its debts. Why does Petit Mort A have 3 terms and not 2 or 4? Because the 3rd synthesis has 3 features. Petit Mort A is tracking what capital does to each one of them. So The caesura moves to le petit mort as scheduled event. The empty form of time moves to objet A as structural void that organizes consumption. Eternal return moves to amortization as serial repetition of the same rather than the return of difference. You can read the manuscript as a specification of what capital does to Deleuze's third synthesis. And Simondon's biology is what lets us see that operation at an ontological level before it's ever political. Simondon's giving us the baseline, Deleuze gives us the temporal structure, and the manuscript names the modification capital is performing on both. I want to really shift gears into something speculative, but I think this we could actually probably do we might have to do a whole episode on speculative metaphysics because I was really excited by this. And that is looking at Roger Penrose's notion of conformal cyclical cosmology.
Triple
So,
C.
just to give some background, Roger Penrose, mathematical physicist, he won the Nobel Prize in 2020. The last 20 years, he's been working on this notion or this theory of conformal cyclic cosmology. The short version of that is the universe doesn't end at heat death, but that heat death is a phase transition. How that works is every aeon that the universe proceeds through, or every aeon of the universe proceeds through its thermodynamic history, entropy does increase, stars burn out, black holes evaporate through Hawking radiation. Eventually, all massive particles decay, and what remains is only massless particles, such as photons and gravitons. What's interesting, and this even goes to the third synthesis in my kooky brain, at least, massless particles don't experience time or scale, which also is interesting in the sense of like atoms. And if you're thinking of Democritus or like, I'm blanking on
Lucubus is the other one. There's also Epicurus.
Epicurus is what I was
Yeah.
thinking of. But at that point, something remarkable happens mathematically where the universe is conformal geometry rather. So it's angular structure stripped of all metric information, which would be stuff like distances and durations, or I don't know, longitude and latitude, maybe? I don't know. Perhaps, again, being very speculative here, that becomes identical to the conformal geometry of a Big Bang singularity. The end of one aeon is the beginning of the next, not through a reversal, but through conformal equivalence. And traces of the previous aeon, especially from supermassive black holes, leave imprints which are called Hawking points in the new aeon's cosmic microwave background. I was hearing this as Simondonian because what Penrose is described is like a cosmological scale instantiation of what would be a pre-individual field. You have the conformal boundary where the universe has lost its metric individuation, all extensive structure dissolved, and what remains is pure pre-metric conformal structure. I think that would be what Simondon's pre-individual is at a cosmological scale. Intensive difference, but no extensive metric. Charged, but not individuated. And the condition for new individuation without itself being individuation. What happens to the previous aeon is that it doesn't actually vanish. It actually gets preserved in the pre-individual field as these Hawking points. And these will inflect the next aeon's development without actually determining it. So maybe determination in the last instance. Think about that as like the Gola series too, at a sort of cosmological scale. And that's exactly the logic of amortization at cosmological scale as well, because the pre-individual field accumulates modifications through each of these cycles of individuation with nothing being fully lost, nothing being fully repeated. Each aeon is both continuous with its predecessors through its accumulated field modifications and genuinely new because the pre-individual field is metastable and open to different resolutions. If you think about what Penrose and Deleuze give us together in terms of the third synthesis where the caesura splits time and the eternal return selects what passes through what survives being difference, then triple C, the conformal boundary that ends the aeon, Conformal equivalence is the selection principle, what survives to the next aeon. A similar structure but at different scales, where the threshold event that ends one regime and a selection principle that determines what passes through being not a recognizable continuation, but something that's transformed by that threshold itself. So maybe a phase shift, the selection principle operating at a higher level than what it selects. The eternal return is not itself a present. Conformal geometry is not itself a metric. Both the third synthesis and triple C describe an operation in which structure exhausts itself, but the exhaustion is also the condition for a new structure, and the new structure inherits something the old structure could not have preserved within itself. For Deleuze, the self that habit and memory built can't survive the caesura. But what survives, what passes through as difference, is something the old self could not have produced from within itself because it required the threshold. For Penrose, the aeon that thermodynamic history built cannot survive heat death, but what passes to the next aeon, the conformal structure plus Hawking points, is something that the old aeon could not have produced as content within itself. It required the boundary. So to me, both are saying a similar thing where the threshold is not the failure of the prior regime, but the threshold is the operation by which the prior regime delivers what could have not existed within its content. How this relates to the book, perhaps, is that capitalism isn't just scheduling death. Capitalism is preventing thresholds from being thresholds. It's converting productive caesura into deferred catastrophe. It's trying to keep the system this side of the threshold indefinitely, like gooning us to death,
Mm.
while continuously extracting from the structure that's straining towards it. Real subsumption in this reading is the systematic prevention of productive threshold passage at every scale that capital can reach. And our wager in the manuscript is that this prevention is not totalizable. The threshold feature is more fundamental than even capital, and it operates at scales that capital can't reach all the way down to. So, cosmological in the Penrose sense, biological for Simondon, or ontological for Deleuze. Capital can amortize human individuations, scheduled labor, and consumption, but it can't amortize the conformal boundary. It can't amortize the third synthesis as such. It only attempts to occupy that position locally for as long as historical conditions will allow it. We've been looking at where the field persists despite the schedule, and across the episode, we found three names for that. One, for Simondon, the membrane that repolarizes against neutralization. For Deleuze, the caesura that can't be contained by the schedule. For Penrose, the conformal boundary that preserves charge through heat death. These aren't three different things. They're the same operation at three different scales. And the political work is the work of keeping the threshold productive at the scale where capital most aggressively tries to convert it into deferred catastrophe. Simondon gives us biology. Deleuze gives us the temporal philosophy. Penrose gives us cosmology. And the manuscript is the argument these are the same operation at different scales, that capital's specific historical project is the prevention of productive threshold passage at every scale where it can reach. That was
I
a little
like
bit left field, but I was thinking the way that Triple C pointed to like a certain like not amortization, but what was it? Where like the pre-individual aspect of the prior aeon in the form of the Hawking points, etc. That sounded very Simondonian in terms of individuation, where there's also determination in the last instance sort of thing, where there's influence, but there's not full-on determination because
yeah.
there's always the sort of remainder that persists in each iteration of time or the universe.
I like you bringing in the Penrose to deepen all of these reflections. It's food for thought. One thing that's interesting, though, is he says, it is because life is the resolution of problems that it remains something residual, a detritus that cannot take on signification, a remainder after all the operations of individuation. What remains in the old being is what has been unable to be integrated, the unassimilated, from the apeiron before individuation to the apeiron after life, from the undetermined of the before to the undetermined of the after, from the first us to the last us, an operation is carried out that does not break down into dust. Life is in its present, in its resolution, not in its remainder. And death exists for the living being in two senses that do not coincide, which I brought up earlier. There's a hostile death from outside, but then there's the amortization that we've been talking about that builds up internally. Your notion of remainder made me think about that passage that I had flagged.
But man, there's all kinds of interesting stuff to think of in terms of the metaphysical implications of triple C. I was thinking about Spinoza. I was thinking about Leibniz here. I was thinking about
Yeah.
Simondon. I don't think we necessarily want to get into that.
We don't have to do it today. I think that triple C is something I'll want to look into more because you're the one that introduced me to the notion. And so that's something I'll want to chew on more, and it's exciting.
So I think what brought this on, and I don't know if this is even true for Penrose, I think the issue is that we've observed these universes that are not these universes, but like these clusters of stars
Mhm.
that would be like, it doesn't make sense for them to exist because the universe is not that old or something like that.
Mhm.
But I could be conflating.
I remember reading more about astronomy 20 years ago. And, back then there was, in terms of dating, there was all kinds of controversy about how some of the oldest stars and star systems and galaxies seem to be dated to be younger, or sorry, be older than the universe itself in terms of its projections. And so it's been a problem that I assume maybe that prompted Penrose to look into it, and this question of what's wrong with our metric, and how are our approximations and our estimations so off, because that seems like a logical impossibility that there could be this chronological mismatch.
So what's interesting about the two, like I think it's gravitons and photons, they're kind of like atoms in that kind of classical Democritus sense. Although they do move, they move at the speed of light, but they don't experience time or distance or something like that, which is
Hmm.
fucking wild. The Hawking points to like there's something interesting there with respect to Leibniz. I think there's something interesting in terms of substance, in terms of Spinoza and substance relative to those particles. I think that maybe the frameworks that Leibniz and Spinoza were working through maybe didn't allow them to speak fully, right? Like about they didn't have the terminology or concepts to work through what they were really kind of pointing towards. And
Mm-hmm.
substance ontology for both of them perhaps is the best kind of grasp towards what they were trying to do, because I think a lot of people I think would assume that the speculative metaphysics of Leibniz and Spinoza is just pure philosophy, but I don't that doesn't bear out, right? Because for one, Leibniz invented calculus, or at least differential
Mm-hmm.
calculus, and two, Spinoza's method was based on geometry, or he
Mm-hmm.
was heavily influenced by geometry, and people often forget that Newton himself, he had other theories, and his methodology in his other theories wasn't that different from what he used to develop his actual equations in terms of physics. That's something, again, we can save for another episode, but I just want to maybe tease that a little bit.
Yeah, that's good. I like that.
I mean, it kind of reminds me too, in some regard, I was thinking about how I think what Simondon does is he gives he adds a little bit of nuance to Marx, because the charge is often that Marx is an economic determinist or something like that. Like you hear that, there's a direct kind of one to one, like the material base generates the superstructure, right? Like, and
Yeah.
people take issue with that. So again, maybe it's that Marx is doing the best that he can with the tools and concepts that he has available. And I think you can take something like dialectic and rethink it as a gesture toward like I think transduction is, in a very broad way, there is a kind of seemingly dialectical process, but it's not. It's like the historical mode of thought itself. Obviously, there's a trajectory, there's a history, there's something, there's a trace that gets passed on to the next generation of thinkers or something like that. So I don't know. I've been thinking about that as an interesting way to think about the development of thought itself. I've been blathering on, so unless you have anything to add.
I feel pretty good about this episode. We did some good stuff. You brought the spice to the cookout. I'm gonna look into more about the Penrose stuff. Just as a teaser, did you still you wanted to do the
Yeah, the Seaford book,
the
right?
Seaford? Yeah, so we'll do that. And you already told me what we're gonna do. We're gonna do the opening
Yeah, I may.
five chapters or
Well,
so.
let me. I'll reevaluate
Okay,
that. I think
okay.
I may. What I may do is just structure it to where as I started to look into it more, I think maybe some of the speculative stuff that I was de-emphasize is actually something that I want to do. So
Okay, cool. Yeah. Take a look at it.
yeah, so we're going to be taking a look at Richard Seaford's Money and the Early Greek Mind, Homer, Philosophy and Tragedy, and I think specifically like Alfred Sohn-Ruthel has a hypothesis about exchange being tied to abstract thought. So I don't want to get too much into that. And that's going to wrap up this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour. And we will see y'all next week to talk about money and the early
The
Greek
very
mind.
rules of healing, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious, the whole state of things, the pure violence without object. This is a typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.